Welcome to Birds Learning Network Adult Literacy Webinar Series. We're thrilled to have you join us for this innovative program that integrates literacy with historical awareness and consciousness building. Through thoughtfully designed sessions, you'll gain valuable insights and tools to confidently engage in the literacy process. We hope you find this journey enlightening and transformative. Enjoy your experience with us. So good morning again, everyone. Thank you so much for joining in. Welcome to today's webinar. Again, it's just amazing to have you all here. I'm looking forward to a wonderful session today, a wonderful, lively, interactive discussions that we will be having regarding some of the ideas that I will be sharing today. And absolutely, I welcome you all to participate again in the conversation, to share your thoughts and ideas as we navigate through today's session. So we're going to get started. So I'll start off with the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the land on which we are situated for thousands and thousands of years has been the traditional land of Indigenous peoples, and more recently, the peoples of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. This land, called Turtle Island, is the meeting place of many Indigenous peoples, and our colonial and post-colonial ancestors came as settlers on this land. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work and to learn on this land. We also recognize the enduring presence of all Indigenous peoples. I want to also pay tribute to our ancestors and by pouring libation. And so in honoring the spirits of our ancestors, we honor the footprints of our brave ancestors who have left an indelible dome of courtesy, love, kindness, compassion, power, tenacity, strength, wisdom, bravery, might, and excellence. In the spirit of Ubuntu, I say, we are because they were. I am because of you. We vow to use these truths to enhance our development and cultivate the breadth of all of our humanity in order to liberate the mind, body, and soul of all who continue to rest in the shade and shadows of history and command the harvest of today in light of our individual and collective greatness. So just to quickly review today's agenda. And so, of course, we'll start off with our welcome and introduction. And then after, we'll transition to the definition that I will be providing or using of literacy. Then we'll move on to the foundational principles in looking specifically at the need for cultural awareness. We'll also not dwell too much, but we will speak about phonemes and language acquisition in terms of what that process is. We'll also look at connecting back to cultural awareness. This is actually the gist of today's presentation. We'll also speak about sensibilities and sensitivity to resist stereotypes and gain confidence and ways in which we can do so. And then in looking at how we creatively articulate the processes, not just linguistic processes, but also processes in coming to understand or to be culturally and historically aware, to root our understanding in a more deeper, critical, and thorough understanding of literary work. Specifically, we'll be looking at Maya Angelou's Still I Rise. So we'll use Maya Angelou's poem as a way of actually diving or even digging even more critically and deeper into the historical processes, cultural and historical processes of literacy and what that is and how we can situate our understanding of such for even more deeper and even more personal engagement. And then, of course, we'll talk about navigating social barriers, and then we'll wrap up with a recap of the key points of discussion, and I'll open the floor up to a Q&A. And so you can share your thoughts and ideas in terms of the ideas that are discussed again, as I've mentioned. So again, welcome. I know you all are familiar with myself, but as an introduction, again, my name is Kathy Lewis. And in terms of my own positionality, I am a person of Black African Caribbean descent. I was born in Jamaica, the land of the Taino and the Arawak and African indigenous people. Of course, Jamaica meaning land of wood and water. I am currently residing in Lindsay, Ontario, located in the traditional territory of the Mississauga, Nishnabeg, peoples of the Mississaugas. This area is part of what is now known as the city of Kawartha Lakes in Ontario. I'm an educator, as you all know, holding a BA and a BEd in English and Criminology from York University, master's degree in education with a focus on social justice education and also collaborative specialist in education policy. I'm currently, of course, a PhD student at OISE, where I'm focusing on Black community development. And of course, with over a decade of experience in teaching and learning. And I'm, of course, passionately committed to making education accessible to all. Okay, so I've included decolonial. We're thinking more so of the colonial processes because we know that the world in which we live has been, deeply reconstructed following the event of colonization, right? And so not just in terms of the geography of such, but also that geography can also be positioned within the psychological, within the spiritual, and again, and is also steeped even within the cultural processes too. And we'll see how that is the case, because the purpose of colonization was to not just only dispossess or displace people from land. The purpose of colonization was to displace people from self, because when we displace people from self, what we do here is that we sever, well, but that was the intention, to sever any sort of connection to that of land. And so when we think of land, land is not just a place or a space that is occupied by bodies, right? Land is also very much steeped in language, right? How we navigate the world. I'm thinking of Negushi's work, right? When he speaks about language and how, as a child growing up, his cultural language was one that was rooted in the environment and the surrounding. And this is something that I can even speak to of my own, based on my own experience growing up, in Jamaica. And so land is not just a place or a space that's been occupied, or that is occupied by people. Land also carry cultural, spiritual nuances that also very much form identities, right? And so there is a need to not just be aware of the historical processes that have happened in order to sever people from land, but it's also how we reposition our thoughts and ideas in that, and being very intentional and being very strategic as to how we resist, because we know that colonization is not something as in the past or post. But we can also think of neocolonization, which is in the new form that it takes, and especially rooted in capitalism. And so that part or piece is also very important. So we'll be taking a decolonial praxis. In addition to the theories and conceptualization of renowned scholars such as Dr. Day, again, my ideas are also, again, being influenced by my mentor, Dr. George Day, where he actually brings the idea of the multicentric approach to education, meaning that we're centering or decentering particular Eurocentric knowledges that are oftentimes presented as the norm. And oftentimes the pushback against this is that, well, we do understand that, but then we also have to think about, how do we create and innovate around that for the purpose of future and what those futures look like, right? But we can also reimagine those futures as one that are also very much so, again, connected to that of reparation, because when we think of reparation, we're not just looking at colonial damages that have been done. We're also thinking about reparation in terms of how we repair spirits that have been broken. And when we think of that reparation, we can also, in terms of spirit that's been broken, I'm thinking of Bettina Love's idea of spirit murdering. We can also think about how we can reposition that within our own critical consciousness, because we also, too, owe ourselves that in terms of how we reimagine and reposition ourselves in the world and the criticalities that come with that. And so, of course, Malefi's ideas of the Afrocentrism, again, ideas that are rooted in African indigenous epistemologies. Epistemologies meaning the way of understanding how we navigate the world. And for us in the diaspora, these are very much so rooted in who we are. I'm thinking of Dr. Joki Wan's work, when she speaks about the spirit that cannot be colonized. And so because the spirit cannot be colonized, there are multiplicities of possibilities that we can engage in. And those can also help us to reimagine a world or structure, not just in terms of how we resist ongoing colonization or colonial processes, but how we recreate for and reimagine or imagine for generational for generations to come. I also will be looking at or using the National Council for English Teachers definition of literacy. I will provide that. Dr. Scarborough's, as I've mentioned before, illustrations of the upper and the lower strands of language comprehension. As I said, this is a decolonial praxis that is also connected to that of Western, not just Western frame of understanding per se, but how we also bring knowledges that are also very much a part of mainstream. Then, of course, critical race theory, I'll explain for those of us who are not familiar with this particular frame or the tenets of critical race theory and what this is and how we can also use, and this is not me promoting CRT, I'm just using this as our lens to show you how we can, again, develop that critical understanding as to how we deconstruct. So when we deconstruct, we're not just looking at the grammatics of language itself, but we're looking at how language is presented in multiple forms or genres that are oftentimes used to form modes of resistances. And oftentimes writers also use these as a way of making sense of their own experiences that are oftentimes very much historically rooted and are based, and also bringing in contemporary notions as to how, not just how they resist, but how these spaces or places of resistances are or can be seen in the broader communal context, right? And so, again, bringing in the collective efforts and the work that is needed, in that, because as we understand, consciousness is not just about the individual, but it's also very much so about the collective. And I've mentioned W.E.B. Du Bois and Nkrumah's ideas when they speak about, mass consciousness, critical mass consciousness. Mass consciousness is how we, going back to Du Bois' idea, how we personalize or repersonalize, because colonization is meant to depersonalize, is to separate self from self. So how do we personalize or bring in back the African personality? And I've seen my sister here, Vern, joined just now. I'm thinking of even your work, Vern, that you've mentioned in thinking about that essentialism. Yes, there's an invisible thread, even though we can think of the multiplicities of cultures, and we understand that Black culture and African or Black culture is not monolithic, meaning that it's not just one, right? But we can also imagine that imaginary thread, right, that weaves us together, that very much so forms, similarities And it's not just about the imaginary thread. And of course, when we start our discussion, oh, I'd love to hear from your thoughts and ideas, all of our thoughts and ideas. But it's also not just being critically aware, but it's what we do with that critical consciousness that is also very much so important. So these are, again, the premises that I'll be using in formulating the ideas that are presented today in terms of how we revolutionize literacy, specifically in terms of adult literacy, right? And we'll also speak about what's the distinction between that and that of if we're approaching the junior intermediate level. I know that there are lots of educators joining in and people from different spaces. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts and ideas as well. So in terms of the learning objectives, I think I've already alluded to some of these. Understand the definition and importance of literacy and what that is. So defining literacy, as I said, the definition that I'll be providing, integrate cultural awareness in literacy, as I've mentioned before, promote critical thinking and analysis, especially, this is critically important because remember, as I said, excuse me, what we are resisting, what we are understanding is that of an ongoing colonial process that is meant to separate. So it's not self-celebratory, right? Meaning that it doesn't affirm identities, indigenous identities. And so because it does not affirm indigenous identities, right? It is very important that there's always a sense of critical consciousness and awareness. And I'm thinking of Dr. Day's work, when he talks about decolonization as an ongoing process. It's not a process that is, you arrive or anyone can ever claim that they have arrived. We're talking about generational impacts, right? Language was used as a tool. It was a primary tool that was used. So it was the primary tool that was used. It means then that I'm going to read a quote from Noguchi's work as well. Because it was a primary tool that was used, it means then that we must be critically aware, right, of what that means. Because if we're not critically aware, then this is where the dilemma and the danger comes in, right? It's not just about the distortion of self in terms of who we are, but it does not affirm who we are as an individual. So we're always pitted against self. I'm also thinking about James Baldwin. He also says something. He said that, listen, the problem here is that it's when it's internalized. Because when it's internalized, no, you become an enemy of self. So you're not just fighting against external enemies, you're also fighting against your own self because your own existence becomes a distortion, right? So as I've said before, it's critically important that we're not just looking at the grammatics, and I'm not trying to negate that. Yes, it's absolutely necessary, but it's also very much so critically important for us to reposition that critical consciousness as at the forefront, right? I definitely would argue that that should take prevalence over everything else. Because as I've always tell my students, I know of some of my students joining in, that grammatics are things that you can learn, right? Eventually, right? Once you understand the prescriptivism and descriptivism of the language, then of course you can figure out some of the patterns and sometimes the deviations between those patterns, because the language is not set in stone where it's just purely descriptive, where meaning that you see a particular pattern in terms of, say, for example, when we look at verb conjugation, right? So when we say, think of the subject verb agreement. So a singular subject takes a singular verb. So you want to make sure that that pattern follows, not just for in terms of concise, for being concise, but also in terms of what makes sense as to how we've come to form those reasonings and logics as to what makes the language. But there are also irregularities that are positioned in the language as well. Right? So that's where the prescriptivism comes, because when you think of prescriptivism, we are thinking of a world that is always in progress. And because the world is always in progress, there are ideas and new ideas, and the language is the carrier of those ideas. So of course it's not static, and of course it's not set in stone or in a vacuum. But once you develop an understanding or an awareness of that, then you'll eventually gravitate to wanting to learn in critical inquiry. But the consciousness piece now is very important, because it's now how ideas, the purpose and the intention behind ideas. And so that's what it is. So going back to, as I said, I want to read something that Noguchi said. He says that the canon forces the body and the school fascinates the soul. I want you to think of that. Think about it. The canon forces the body and the school fascinates the soul. This is just major. This is critically major, because what Noguchi speaks about here is the strategic, and I always say this, it is very scientific. Colonization is a very scientific process. It was not something that was done by accident. No, it's an experiment. There's experimentation. So that's how we can connect cultural genocide or the Holocaust of enslavement, in quoting Molefi Asante, right? And so it's a Holocaust, and it's ongoing. It's not something that, it took place and it's done and it's over. It's always in process. And so because it's always in process, there needs to be an understanding, first of all, an awareness of that and how we can challenge and resist, right? I'm also thinking of Bell Hooks' ideas, when she speaks about what it means to self-esteem. She redefines self-esteem, and she roots self-esteem in that of radicalism. And when we think of radicalism, oftentimes, this idea is positioned, again, going back to the colonial purview of it, based on canons and all of that, because of the violent nature of it. And I'm not, again, trying to negate the violence of it, because it's quite very violent. We do understand it, right? But it's that mode of resistance. It's the mode of resistance that Bell Hooks also alludes to. Okay, so these are, and of course, addressing social barriers, as I've explained, the resistance is also addressing social barriers. We cannot challenge what we don't know and understand. So understanding is rooted in cultural awareness. It's rooted in cultural awareness. Yes, we can speak our native language, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're culturally aware. It's how we apply that consciousness of that. That's what that awareness is how we resist. And that's what Bell Hooks, in her work, wrought my soul. So we're going to listen to here a definition that is provided and of literacy, not just definition, but in terms of why it's important, and how and what it looks like even within our, Canadian context. All right, so let's listen. Let me just stop sharing for a quick second so I can share my sound. Sorry.
Of adult competencies. But there is help. For more than a century, United for Literacy has been helping Canadians improve their literacy skills so they can navigate life easier and have access to equal opportunities. Melanie Valson, CEO for United for Literacy, joins me this morning to talk more about this. Thanks for being here.
Such a pleasure.
So what does it mean when we say nearly 50% of adults have literacy rates that score below high school level? What does that mean?
Well, it means that we have a big problem when it comes to literacy rates in this country. It means that we have 1 Canadian out of 5 that is struggling, for example, to read the prescription on a bottle of medicine, or that is struggling to navigate the health system, or that is struggling to vote, for example. So we really got to do something about this.
Why are the rates so low?
That's a good question. You know, we at United for Literacy, we really have see every day how literacy changes everything, and how people who are struggling for literacy with literacy are really kind of left behind. So we are seeing why. The whys are people who have not completed high school, for example. We have learners that are newcomers to Canada and have to learn a language. We have people that are also facing learning disabilities, for example. So there's a lot of different reasons. The most important thing, I think, is what can we do about this?
Mm-hmm. Well, I imagine because there are so many different reasons, it makes the answer not straightforward.
Exactly. So at United for Literacy, we think that literacy is a human right. So we really work coast to coast to coast, literally from PEI to BC, all across the Arctic, to bring literacy supports to individuals that need help in acquiring the literacy skills they need to succeed at school, at work, or in life in general.
Melanie, you alluded to this, talking about when there are literacy issues, the challenges someone can face. It feels like a domino effect. If you can't understand or read the text in front of you, what happens then on an individual level?
That's a very important question. So if you are struggling with reading, with writing, and also with numeracy, or even with your digital literacy, how can you navigate the world in which we live in today? I was talking about the health sector earlier. But for example, if you're looking for a job and you want to fill out an application form, but the words are dancing in front of you and you can't really figure out how to fill out that application form. Same thing for application for housing. So you can see how you were talking about a domino effect. Often we can correlate the cycle of poverty with the cycle of low literacy.
And then there's a larger impact too, not just on the personal level, but on the Canadian economy.
That's exactly it. So low literacy levels affect individuals, but entire communities and the entire country. So it affects our productivity, it affects our prosperity, and frankly, as I said earlier, it affects our human rights, basically, in this country.
Well, you can see it right there, where if you can't go get a health problem dealt with, if you can't get to a doctor, if you don't understand the medical instructions given to you, how then are you applying for help and support from the government if you then need it?
Exactly. Yeah. So we really are trying to reach all Canadians that need our support across the country. Just last year, we've reached more than 33,000 Canadians of all ages, again, in all locations. So we are going in the community. We're offering free tutoring support to contribute to solving the problem.
You're meeting people where they're at, and there's a website as well where people can go.
For sure. So you can reach us at unitedforliteracy.ca, and also, again, across Canada, we have offices and a bunch of volunteers and partners that are just waiting to, help people who are needing help.
Melanie, thank you so much for coming in this morning.
Such a pleasure. Thank you.
So again, over 49% of the adult population scored below high school literacy levels, with 17% scoring in the lowest level. And then, of course, we see even more grave impacts on that of newcomers to Canada, who face significant challenges with literacy, often due to language barriers and lack of familiarity with the education system. There's also the Indigenous populations there. And so when we think of Indigenous populations in Canada, who are also very much so experiencing disproportionate, low literacy levels. And then, of course, we have the low-income populations. Low-income groups are more likely to have lower literacy skills, which can impact their ability to find and maintain employment. But and of course, the data is very important because it is what it is. But it's also very much important in terms of how we disaggregate the data, right? What is the actual true meaning or meanings of this? And so in terms of displacement as well as dispossession, because when we think of populations that are marginalized, oftentimes marginalization is as a result of displacement or dispossession. People who have been historically displaced and dispossessed, who again own nativity or indigeneity, are oftentimes placed at a very inferior position. So that can also very much, and languages that are oftentimes, barred from that because their own native or indigenous language or languages, right? Because of course some communities are very multilingual, are oftentimes placed in an inferior position. And of course, when you go back to, say, for example, the enslavement of people of African descent, our own indigenous and native languages were prevented. We weren't, well, yes, we weren't, because we were prevented from even communicating, of course, because for different reasons in terms of resistance and rebellion. But there's been a strategic ongoing attack. And because of that, it's also very much so important to, when we're quoting data, that we are also disaggregating, we're contextualizing what does that mean, right? There are also indigenous languages that have gone extinct, where oftentimes there is a shame or guilt that is associated in speaking one's indigenous language, because it's not seen as, a legitimate form, or even a sophisticated form or way of communicating. And so again, it's critically important because it allows us to realign or reimagine or rethink how we define literacy. Okay, so as I said, I'm using the National Council of Teachers of English Teachers, Teachers of English definition. There are again, different definitions that are provided in terms of what's shown here on the screen. So screen defines literacy as the ability to read, write, and communicate effectively across multiple contexts and modalities. And we'll speak about this as well. This broad definition encompasses not just traditional reading and writing. As I said, I'm not negating that because it's critically important, especially if we're using, language as a tool of resistance, colonial languages, right? And going back to Audre Lorde's idea, in terms of if we can use the master's tool to rebuild the house, right? A lot of writers and scholars have actually presented, similar ideas in terms of, yes, we can, in terms of, how we are strategic and intentional as to how we use that. I'm thinking of there's one particular writer. We've actually studied his work in one of my grade 12 university, English classes, right? Where he talks about how colonization have actually changed the whole course of an entire nation, right? Not just in terms of linguistically, but also in terms of spiritually, right? Because of the attack on self, and how that, the main character, Okonkwo, actually comes to see himself, his masculinity, his manhood, how he positions himself in the community, how he's understood, and how he actually resisted all of this, right? So Chinua Achebe's work very much, is critical in terms of how we see that. So I'm just imagining different modalities and what those modalities are. And so the broad definition encompasses not just traditional reading and writing skills, but also the ability to interpret and create text in various forms, such as digital, visual, and media text. Literacy involves critical thinking, problem solving, and the ability to engage with diverse perspectives and culture. Now, this is very important because, especially in the piece here where it says diverse perspectives and cultures and what those are, right? As I've said, cultures are not just in form, when you think of modalities and multiplicities, because it's not monolithic in that sense. It is also not monolithic in the sense of where it's just one particular group of people speaking the same language or practice, different practicing the same maybe religious beliefs or have the same religious beliefs or values. But it's also how individuals or members in that community assert themselves, even in that, because, and you can reposition this even in the idea of no two people experience the world in the same way, irrespective of culture and language and so forth. So when we think of diverse perspectives as to how they're presented in literary works or literature, can also be very much so telling of how one navigates a particular system and their level of or where they are positioned and on that continuum. So continuum meaning that decolonial continuum, first of all, of gaining consciousness or understanding of history and of major events that have recreated the world in what we know it now to be, and how generational impacts are impactful on different or individuals differently. We can also think about that of when we think of intersectionality or intersectional identities, right? And what those intersectional identities are, right, in terms of possibilities. And I am mentioning these because it is critical, especially in terms of where we're heading with today's conversation, as to how in literature, literary works oftentimes are used as a gateway to transport some of these ideas and cultural awareness. But where it gets a little tricky is that oftentimes if recipients are not don't have the requisite or prerequisite understanding of what those are, then oftentimes ideas will just, go over their heads, even in beginning to critically engage with a literary work. So it's not just about understanding phonics or understanding sentences or understanding lexicon or understanding morphology and all of those, right? In terms of, say, for example, how verbs are conjugated, those are critically important. But it's also how those are also used, the grammatics of language are also used as a way of transporting ideas and also as a way of resisting. And so if there's not an understanding of that, then it can also very much so impacts our ability to critically engage with the text that we are looking through or looking at. So again, that's a definition. So interpret and create text in multiple forms, understand and engage with diverse perspectives, as I've said, and cultures, use language effectively for communication and learning, critically analyze and question information and media, participate actively in society and contribute to the community. Again, this is a comprehensive view that recognizing that literacy is essential for personal, social, and economic development in our rapidly evolving world. And it's very important that even with specialization, there is always room for improvement because learning is an ongoing process, right? And of course, at the root of that is also humility, right? I'm thinking of Dr. Day's work as well, right? At the root of that is humility. It's a recognition that we're always in the process of knowing. And because we're always in the process of knowing, there are also always possibility for not just being creative and innovative, but also possibility of growth, right? And how we also make that a collective responsibility, right? Again, in the spirit of Ubuntu, right? I am because you are because I am, right? So again, we're not just individually locating ourselves, but we're also communally locating ourselves. So this is again the key ideas that are presented from the National Council for Teachers of English that I'll be using as well. So interact with the world, right? So at its simplest, literacy is the way that we interact with the world around us, how we shape it and are shaped by it. It is how we communicate with others via reading and writing, but also by speaking, listening, and creating. It is how we articulate our experience in the world and declare, we are here. For me, this is the most critical, declaring we are here, right? So meaning that, of course, how we affirm ourselves in all of these processes of being or becoming. I'm thinking of Michelle Obama's, right? All of these processes of becoming, how we declare ourselves, how we're not intimidated by ideals that have been constructed and set up, right, as to what it means to be human, that are oftentimes outside of the parameters of our own cultural and linguistic, values and principles that foregrounds who we are as an individual, right? And I'm hearing my mother's voice in my head right now. In terms of some of the saying that, she often said. And so it's very important that we affirm ourselves within those as well and declaring, that we are here. That's very important. So now, going back to, as I said, Scarborough's ideas that I've mentioned. So in addition to the National Council for Teachers of English, I'm also joined on the ideas presented by Scarborough in terms of how comprehension or literacy, the two main ideas or categories that are used again, navigating a comprehensive understanding of literacy, right? So he speaks about that of word recognition and that of language comprehension. So word recognition and that of language comprehension. So in the context of reading and literacy, the read and wrote model by Dr. Hollis Scarborough visualizes the development of skilled reading by interweaving multiple strands. So these strands are grouped into two main categories. One, the lower strands, which is the word recognition. And then two is the upper strands, which is language comprehension. So what is a strand, right? A strand is in context of literacy and education refers to a specific component or aspect of a broader skill set or subject area. So in literacy, strands represent the various elements that contribute to the reading, writing, speaking, and understanding language, right? So for the lower strands, the word recognition level, you can think of phonological awareness. You can think of decoding. And then, of course, there's the sight recognition. So specifically, these are some examples and definitions. So phonological awareness, meaning that recognizing and manipulating the sound structures of language, such as phonemes, syllables, and rhymes, right? So how sounds are associated to specific letters or symbols, right? And how those are oftentimes grouped to create a particular word, as we all know. And then, of course, there's decoding, applying knowledge of letter sound relationships and to read and pronounce words. So this is the fluency of it, when we can actually fluently pronounce words based on the symbols and the sounds associated. And then, of course, there's a sight recognition. And so when we move beyond that pronunciation, we go towards a sight recognition of that, instantly recognizing familiar words without needing to decode them, right? And so that's the lower level of the language in terms of the word level. And then, of course, we have the upper strands or comprehension strands. So for these, we can think of these areas or aspects of background knowledge, vocabulary, right? And vocabulary can be very nuanced, again, because we know that language is not static. Languages oftentimes borrow from each other. Specifically, if we think of the colonial context, again, even the English language itself, I don't know if I would even call it borrowing, but anyways, and so vocabulary, we can think of vocabulary. There's also the language structure. So there's a verbal reasoning. There's literacy knowledge. These are some examples of such, right? So background knowledge, knowing that a whale, this is example, a whale is a large marine. So of course, that's the knowledge that is associated to. But this can also be, for this example, not just about nuance, but it can also be interpreted and understand based on cultural knowledges or epistemologies, right? Because what we see as mainstream in terms of specific habitats, their purposes, and how we align ourselves with these are also very much so can be very ideological. So it's very important that we are critically aware of those as well, not because we've been taught or conditioned to see or understand specific ideas in a particular way, that doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't other ideas that are associated or those ideas are illegitimate, right? And so it's very important that we understand that. There's the vocabulary, understanding the word, right? And we have benevolent there and what it means. Again, it can be when we think of connotations and denotations of language, meaning that what the dictionary definition of the language of the word is versus that of the secondary or associated meaning, right? So which is the connotative meaning of words. Sometimes writers are very strategic as to how they present these ideas, and oftentimes writers as a form of resistance, because I've seen where in so many different instances where writers also reconceptualize, right, as a way or mode of resistance, and so they again will bring in maybe a double meaning, right? Or a meaning that is very multidimensional in terms of how it's presented, but it's rooted in cultural awareness, cultural understanding, right? That can also be very highly subjective based on the individual experiences, right? But the key here, or the criticality here, is that how do we begin to understand some of these modalities, right? As we are working through, it takes critical awareness. There's the language structures, recognizing that a cat, and the example here, cat. So we're talking about sentence. So when we think of a sentence, we know what a sentence is: subject, verb, making sense, right? Subject of the sentence can be who or what the sentence speaks about, can be a noun or a pronoun. And of course, we can even go deeper in terms of tenses if we're looking at the past tense, the present tense, the future. And if we break it down into the perfect tense and what that is, right? Again, structurally based on the English language, we can also align that to our own understanding, because time is also dealt with and understood differently in different languages. Right? I've had lots of conversations with students who will say, Miss, well, we don't necessarily conjugate based on all of these different tenses. We show time, or we articulate time differently, right? So it's very important that we are also very much aware of this, so that we can not just only resist, but also interrupt oftentimes biases that are also very stereotypical, because what it does here, it severs self from self, because it positions what is superior versus inferior, what is sophisticated, what is intelligent versus that of what is not. And I'm thinking of the Jamaican patois, or language. And of course, I do agree with Louise Bennett when she talks about that. And she talks about dirty tough. And she uses that as a way of articulating different economical spaces and places where, average Jamaican oftentimes have to navigate, and how they come to make sense and resist, and also not just use that as a way of culturally aligning and affirming self, but also, using that as a form of motivation and inspiration. And in Jamaica, we say, well, use your hand, or take your hand, make fashion, right? And so even within that saying, meaning being very critical and innovative in any given way, shape, or form, whether it's, trying to come up with a meal, an idea for a meal, because you only have certain ingredients to cook, right? So I'm going to just use this, right? So we see, and of course, it gets even more, it can be even more nuanced, because it's understood and used in different ways. And so language structure is very important, but we also need to understand how language structure is often used as spaces of resistance. There's the verbal reasoning, making inferences and understanding figurative language. I've just used one there in the Jamaican patois, right? Take your hand on fashion. Same idea, well, similar in terms of, how the language is innovative, how the language is spontaneous, how the language, again, is very sophisticated in its form, right? And how oftentimes writers will use different forms. I'm thinking of Maya Angelou too. She shares her experience of a poem that she wrote. And the poem that she wrote was, she said she was inspired by an individual. She was traveling on the bus once, and there was an individual, this woman, and the woman was just laughing. And she wondered, she's like, this lady's not just laughing because she wants to laugh or there's something funny, but her laughter was one of how, not only how she asserts or reasserts herself, but it's one that is also very much rooted in community, because she, at that particular moment, calls community in recognition and acknowledgement of self. And especially in the way that she laughs, where she laughs, and how she resists, societal norms that are oftentimes placed, right? And so Angelo brings us into that as to what that is and how that is. And so when we think of verbal reasoning and making inferences and understanding figurative language and spaces, oftentimes we can think about those in terms of how even utterances are oftentimes used as, modes of transportations of those, right? In terms of how we occupy space or spaces. There's a literacy knowledge, understanding how texts are organized. And the various genres and their features. This is very major, very, very major, especially for people who are avid readers, right? And also, especially in our world, in our informational age, where oftentimes different genres oftentimes merge. I am reading Octavia Butler's work, Kindred, and beautifully written, just amazingly written in terms of how she uses time travel as a way of actually not just bringing in cultural awareness and historical awareness, right? But also how she uses that as a way of understanding the deeper aspects of self, right? In looking at how the past is connected to the present. The past is not just the past, is the present as well, right? Excuse me. So that is also connected to Sankofa. African principle of Sankofa, right? Looking back in order to move forward. And so literacy, knowledge is critically important, right? So going back to, knowing who you are and knowing who you are, again, is also very much so connected to knowing where we're going, right? Marcus Garvey's ideas, right? It's very important, right, as a culture and people in understanding who we are in order to imagine where we're heading to. So this is the final key component that I've added to Scarborough's ideas as the cultural and historical literacy that is needed, is extremely needed. Why and how does it mean? I think I've already explained all of this. Being critically aware of your own culture involves understanding and reflecting on the norms, values, beliefs, and practices that shape your worldview. It requires recognizing how cultural background influences your thoughts, behaviors, interactions with others and with the world, right? Itself. And I think I've already explained this based on my own upbringing and my own interactions, even with my mother. Developing critical and cultural historical literacy involves understanding and analyzing historical events and cultural context with a critical eye. The key point there is critical eye. Critical eye is extremely important, right? It is extremely important because, of course, it offers up that contextual. There are 5 key aspects, right? Which again offers up contextual awareness, understanding historical, social, political, and cultural context in which events occur, including language usage, and I've explained how that is the case as well, right? So, for example, here the Harlem Renaissance, for those of us who are familiar, and if you're not familiar with the Harlem Renaissance, right, as to the movement, right, of people from the North to the South, in seeking economic, not just economic, but community restoration, right? Because again, of the ongoing displacement and deprivation, right? That was very much so seen in the South, right? A lot of the southern states in the United States, right, where, of course, I'm thinking of Martin Luther King, where he says that, well, what was promised was not given, right? Enslaved individuals were given their freedom, okay? And so, but it was mainly freedom to famine, freedom to poverty, because there was no land, there was no access to education, right? So we see that, again, that surge where people, again, in community, trying to, use that collective innovation and collective strength as a way off. So we see, great writers who came out of the Harlem Renaissance, right? Langston Hughes, I'm thinking of Langston Hughes' work. And then, of course, there's a source evaluation, critically assessing the credibility and reliability of historical sources, evaluating primary and secondary sources for bias, perspective, and authenticity, There's a multiple perspectives, considering diverse viewpoints and experiences to gain a comprehensive understanding of historical events. And the example given there, examining the narratives of both enslaved people and slave owners to understand the complexities of slavery. Right. So it's going more so moving away from the marginal approach or approaches to that of more so a critical approach of comprehension. And then, of course, there's critical thinking, analyzing and questioning historical narratives and cultural practices to uncover deeper meanings and implications. So investigating the causes and consequences of colonialism on Indigenous population, historical empathy. So again, developing empathy by understanding the experiences and emotions of people from different historical and cultural backgrounds, right? So it could be reading personal letters and diaries from historical figures to appreciate their lived experiences, and appreciation also coming to understand how those are connected to any aspects, right, of those are connected to who we are as an individual. And so here, when we think of the literary frames, and I think I've already alluded to some of these as to scholarship that have been used and continue to, to explore, how we can develop critical literacy and what those are. So there's the African diaspora studies that examines the cultural, social, and historical experiences of people of African descent. There's the Africana studies, an interdisciplinary field that explores the history, culture, and politics of people of African descent. And of course, this is just to give you an overview, right? These are more complex in their positionality, and oftentimes we see emerge or an overlapping because, as mentioned there, interdisciplinary, right? So we'll see ideas that oftentimes are positioned in some of these. Then there's the Black studies, investigate the social, political, and economic condition affecting Black communities, right? And the connection there encourages critical literacy by analyzing texts that address issues of race, identity, and social justice. There's a culturally relevant pedagogy, teaching methods that recognize and incorporate students' cultural backgrounds into their learning process learning process. There is also Indigenous studies, knowledge systems, right? So when we think of Indigenous knowledge systems, studies traditional knowledge and practices of African societies. And so when we think of indigeneity, it is also very much important for us to understand indigeneity, not just within Indigenous sense of what we know it on Turtle Island, but as I've always said, we all are Indigenous to a particular place and space, right? And for a lot of us, if not all of us, we can trace our ancestry back to the continent of Africa, right? How and when? Not everybody came by way of the slave trade. And as I've been reminded by Molefi Asante, that there's nothing Atlantic about the slave trade. And so we call it the European slave trade. And so, not all of us came as a result of that because there were already Indigenous peoples, Black African Indigenous peoples already living, on Turtle Island and been trading and communicating long way before European explorers arrived. And then, of course, critical race theory. We'll listen to Kimberly Crenshaw just to deepen our understanding for those of us who are not familiar with critical race theory, because we're going to be asked to in our activity to think about what we've talked about in terms of the upper and the lower strands of language, and also in applying a theoretical frame. And for those of us who have our own work by virtue of the work that we're doing, feel free to use your own, again, to deconstruct or to think even more so in terms of how we engage in cultural literacy in deconstructing Maya Angelou's, Still I Rise. Right. So, of course, we appreciate Angelou's work for its aesthetic value, but we're thinking more so in terms of as a work of art, right? And how we can imagine and even reimagine form, style, structure that are used, by Angelou to communicate a universal message or themes that she explores in her work, right? So critical race theory analyzes how race and racism intersect with other social stratification. We'll speak a little bit more about that. We'll listen to Kimberly Crenshaw speaks for a minute or so as to what and how she's been inspired. All right, so here we go. This is Kimberly Crenshaw. So she is one of the proponents, the creator, innovator of critical race theory. Her work has been it into legal scholarship, because in looking at the disproportionality of people of African descent, Black bodies that have been incarcerated, right? Where, she presents the idea that this is not because Black people or people of African descent are more, prone to criminality. No, right? We're talking about the over-policing of Black bodies. I'm thinking of Robin Maynard's work. So we'll listen to Crenshaw, and then after we'll listen to, and then we'll move into our breakout session. Here we go.
It was, in fact, my grounding in Black studies that sharpened my view of what was missing in legal education, a concrete understanding of how law participated, facilitated, and insulated the hierarchies that shaped our lives. There was an incapacity to see that extended even to my liberal dean and professors who were at the time dragging their feet and offering courses to explore these questions, or hiring professors who might teach it. I was part of a student movement that sprang to life demanding action. And when it didn't happen, we offered an alternative course, bringing in a variety of professors of color, we called them third world professors back then, to teach Derek Bell's groundbreaking text. Critical legal studies allies gave us independent credit, and with a few twists and turns, out of this student movement came critical race theory, a prism forged by Black and ethnic studies, gender studies, critical legal studies, and applied to race and gender power. And that eventually begat intersectionality. So from standing on the dean's desk in 1982 to standing here today as a recipient of this medal, I can truly say I've come full circle.
Okay, so and just to stand corrected, her ideas are influenced by the work of Derek Bell, right? And so she speaks about how
it was, in fact, my
ideas were created, as I've mentioned before, in that of the legal or the justice system, right? And how there was a need for deeper or critical scholarship to understand the cause and effect of those disproportionalities. And so these are key tenets of critical race theory. So racism is ordinary. Racism is a common experience for people of color. And we can also root that in race as a social construction, right? Race is not biological. Again, race was created as a result of justification of the horrors of enslavement, right? And so the world was reorganized along the color lines, and people of African descent, of darker melanated people, were placed at the bottom of the hierarchy, the social hierarchy, and were afforded access to resources as a result of this. Then, of course, we have interest conversion. So progress in racial equality oftentimes aligns with the interests of the dominant group. So while there is, we have, say, for example, affirmative action, where sometimes it's often said that, well, you're hired because you're Black. No, when you look at the data, it shows that individuals who are of the dominant group are oftentimes privileged, even when there are policies that are put in place to offset again, or to afford, or to present equal opportunities, right? Then there's a social construction, as I've said, of race, socially constructed, meaning that it was created by people for a particular purpose. Differential racialization, different minority groups are racialized in different ways based on societal needs. And you can also not just think about intersectionality, because even intersectionality oftentimes meaning that how identities overlap. So what it means to be a person of African descent, and your gender, as to how you identify, your socioeconomic status, your class status, and it gets even more complicated. And then also we can think of even within specific communities, Black communities, where it gets even more critical because now you can think of shadism, right? And so shadism meaning people of lighter skin tone or complexion that are oftentimes more privileged, right? And so the differential racialization process there, and not just in Black communities, but also communities, other racialized communities as well. I've talked about intersectionality in terms of what that is. And then there's the voice of color thesis, which again, unique perspectives of people of color and valuable in understanding racism, meaning that what makes race real is not the biology of it, but what makes race real is the experience of it, right? The violence that we cannot deny of that. So a lot of people who challenge CRT or even the idea of the construction of race in that, okay, what are you saying then? If it's not biological, then how can we claim then that, how can we claim racism, right? So you've already disproven the idea, but no, the idea is based on the violence, right? That is experienced as a result. And I'm thinking of Fanon's work. I know that there are some scholars joining in here who've been, again, using Fanon's ideas in their own research as well. So I am unapologetically me. So these are some questions. I'm going to copy and paste the questions in the chat while we view Angelo's recitation of Still I Rise, right? So what specific historical and contemporary events are alluded to in Angelo's poem? How do these references enhance your understanding of the poem's themes? Which social and political issues are implicitly addressed in Angelo's poem? How do these issues resonate with current societal challenges? In what ways do Angelo's poetic form and style reinforce the main themes of her poem? How does the structure of the poem contribute to its overall impact? And then for voice, tone, and delivery, how do voice, tone, intonation, and enunciation work together to convey the poem's message? Describe the synergy between these elements and the poem's themes. What observations can you make about the lines in each stanza? How does each stanza contribute to the poem's narrative and thematic development? And final questions here, cultural sensibilities. How does engaging in Angelo's poem sharpen your cultural awareness and sensibilities? What insights do you gain about your own cultural identity and the experiences of others? So you don't need to, because I wanted us to actually have a breakout session, but in the interest of time, what we can do here is that we can maybe just focus one particular area and just focus on the questions for those areas. And I'll give you about maybe 5 minutes or so to think through, and then I'll just open the floor up for us to share our thoughts and ideas. I want us to also place what we've talked about so far in terms of cultural literacy and how we come to define what that is and why it is important and how it's situated in language acquisition. Okay, so let me just stop sharing for a quick minute and I'll share the questions there. All right, so let's listen to Angelo.
You may write me down in history.
Can you hear
with your
it,
bitter,
Otto?
twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still like dust,
Yes, that's it.
I'll rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? Just because I walk as if I have oil wells pumping in my living room. Just like moons and like suns with the certainty of tides, just like hope springing high, still I rise. Did you want to see me broken, bowed head and lowered eyes, shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries? Does my sassiness upset you? Don't take it so hard just because I laugh, as if I have gold mines digging in my own backyard. You can shoot me with your words, you can cut me with your lies, you can kill me with your hatefulness, but just like life, I rise. Does my sexiness offend you? Oh. Does it come as a surprise that I dance as if I have diamonds at the meeting of my thighs? Out of the huts of history's shame I rise. Up from a past rooted in pain I rise. A black ocean leaping and wide, welling and swelling and bearing in the tide. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear I rise. Into a daybreak miraculously clear I rise. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave. I am the hope and the dream of the slave. And so, wow. There I go.
Okay, so I'll give you 5 minutes to think through. So I'll just leave this on the screen so that you'll see. So think about the questions. I've posted the questions in the chat, and I'll just leave this here. So going back to the question, so let's have an open floor conversation. I want to hear your thoughts. I'm eager to hear your thoughts as to how you've actually come to understand some of the ideas that Angelo shares using the questions here that are based on cultural literacy as what we've talked about, cultural and historical literacy. Okay, so I'm going to open the floor up. I'm just going to stop sharing. So if you feel comfortable with your cameras off, absolutely, that's okay. If you feel more comfortable, feel free to turn your cameras on. Again, should you choose, totally your choice. But I want to hear your thoughts. We want to hear your thoughts based on Angelo's. And so
sassiness and sexiness. And we know that one of the ways that we see the commonalities among Black cultures is through our cultural expressions, such as poetry, dance, music, our rhythm, the way we understand, the way we express ourselves, the way we laugh. Even when you talked about the lady laughing on the bus, the way we have that loud laugh, that joyous laugh, and no matter what is going on in our lives, no matter how much they try to kick us down, that joy, that Black joy, can never ever be suppressed. And you can see that come out in the way she expresses herself in that poem. And so we see that no matter how what the challenges and the barriers that we experience in our everyday lives as Black people, we are resilient, and our resilience is very, very visible in the way we celebrate, the way we express ourselves, our languages, our tones in the way we speak, the expressions on our face, these things that only, like, it is, you can't even really put it into words because it's felt, it's an essence. And so again, it is something that it challenges Eurocentric ways of thinking and of being, because Eurocentric ways of being and thinking is often very rational, very it has to be written in ink. But for the essence of Blackness, there's some things that transcends the written. It transcends the rational. it goes beyond, and it talks, it reaches spirituality. It reaches a feeling that that we share, and we don't even need to speak it. We look at each other and we feel it, even through a smile, you know. So it's that essence of blackness that poem is. It captures this essence of blackness and this cultural, common cultural thread that binds us together as Black people, and that we need to tap into this common thread, and you know, and also appreciate the also the diversity within Blackness, because again, we're not monolithic. There's so many differences in Blackness, and yes, we have this common thread, but we also need to appreciate the differences in which we experience these, in which we express and experience our Blackness, right? And use this as a unifying agent. We need, in instead of fighting each other, we need to see how alike we are, and our and the where we come from. We come from very similar histories. Our histories are shared, so we need to start looking at our shared experiences, and you know, and instead of fighting each other, and come together, and we are forced to reckon with, right? Yeah, so there's so much more I can say on this, my sister, you know that, but I'll give somebody else a chance.
Thank you so much, my sister. It's always great to hear you and hear from you, your thoughts and ideas. Again, very insightful. I love what you've talked about in terms of the transformative nature of Blackness, and even quite a conundrum, because yes, you know, we understand that it's not monolithic. It's very diverse, but even at the root of it, right? We see that commonality or similarities there. So I love that. I love what you've mentioned too, in terms of the purpose, you know, how we can use it strategically as a unifying force, not just only in terms of how we challenge and resist, but also in terms of how we navigate different spaces of resistances. And I'm thinking again of your work, especially, you know, carceral spaces, right? Especially when it comes to our youths, you know, what are some of the tools that we can offer them to strategically realign themselves to themselves, especially within the nature of colonization, where oftentimes, as you've mentioned, it pits you know, community members, right, or people against each other. So we're busy fighting each other while the colonizers are out there stealing our lands and our bodies and our spirits and our souls. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to go over to Dr. Bailey. Thank you so much for joining in.
Thank you, Kathy. I'm answering the social and political commentary, which social and political issues are implicitly addressed in Angelo's poem. I think Angelo, she captures the social moves, or the social movement from the invisibility to the visibility of especially Black women. She unravels notions of respectability, to say, yes, we can laugh, we can whine, we can, you know, we can do what we want as mothers of the earth. Politically, she's sending a message, and the message is about sexual exploitation and how Black women bodies are seen, moving again from silence and marginalization. She's almost toying with the sexual wantings that people of other races have, you know. And I think currently, I think one thing that I struggle with as a parent, is the explicitly oval sexualization and sexual behaviors that are aimed at our children that I can see in the arts. And how do we go about addressing that?
That's a critical question, Dr. Bailey, because it makes me think about authenticity in expression. So where do we place authenticity in that, in terms of creative and innovative expression?
We're the founders of authenticity.
Mm.
We're the most we are in all the races. We're the ones. Anything we do is replicated. We could look at dancehall music in Jamaica to see how that's replicated by other groups, you know. So we don't have a problem with being authentic. I think what we haven't done is figure a way how to capitalize on and let others pay for pirating our arts.
That's exactly what I was about to say, because the reason why I ask you that question about authenticity is, oftentimes we see censorship, and we see, of course, we see how it's very hypocritically done, because then when others co-opt and appropriate our culture, it's okay, right? And they can become millionaires. They can go to the bank, whereas for us, it is oftentimes received with these stereotypical notions, right? Or blackness is seen as that it's too wild and it's too vile and it's too out of place or it's too out of order and all of that. And then you place that even within the context of, I'm going into Jamaica, where oftentimes we see social class differences, right? Where people in what is seen or deemed to be social elites oftentimes turn their nose up, right? Towards certain things. But we know that it's a mask, because they themselves also participate and also, benefit from all of that. So that's what I was wondering. How do we make it where I am here, declaring to the world that, listen, I know who you are, I know who I am, and I'm here and I ain't going anywhere. I'm thinking of Afua Cooper's work, right? So, right. Sorry. So
I think the world knows we're here. When you're talking, I was thinking about when I don't know if it was exposed accidentally or when Janet Jackson's breast was shown via her performance. And I'm thinking about Miley Cyrus gyrating on, I forgot his name, and how the two were looked at. And I'm thinking about, when certain bodies dance, it's seen as original, but nothing is original. We can look back at videos coming out of Africa from ancient times to see that we have this music in our blood. In Carol Cooper's work, Noises in the Blood, talks about music in our blood and spirituality. So I think that we are seen as that, not because of our inheritance being colonized people. We don't have the literacy to know how to capitalize. And so we're always being undervalued. And we don't receive the monies that we should.
So how do we bring that awareness?
I think it is becoming increasingly difficult right now. And at the same time, it can be easy. Increasingly difficult, I think, because the machines are replacing us. And easy, maybe, if we could use the machines to prove originality. But we haven't, our communities certainly need more scholars in that area to go after the pirates.
Mm. No.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
very good point, Dr. Bailey. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
those are
I also
critical.
Yes, and
Go
I
ahead.
also think again it is I always go to the grassroots, and I always, and again I guess because we focus on education. Knowledge is power, people. Knowledge is power. We need to make our community more knowledgeable. When our community becomes knowledgeable, then they realize according to Maya Angelou, the diamonds we have, the oil that we have, everything we have these resources, literally and metaphorically.
Yeah.
We have these resources, and we need to let our communities know how powerful we are, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we need to educate. We need to start going into our communities and educating our communities so
Mm-hmm.
they know the resources they have and they can claim their resources.
Mm-hmm.
We can amplify their voices. Our voices need to be amplified. Our voices need to be collective. Community, people, community, collectivity.
Mm.
That's what we need, right?
Thank you so much. I love what you've mentioned there. And I'm going to get to you, Trisha, because I was thinking about you when Vern spoke. I love what you've mentioned as to how Angelo, right, when we think of the figurative as well as the literal, where she's actually juxtaposing both. Like we're not just talking about literal within the sense of, what we have, but also psychological, spiritual, culturally, right? That we have to offer the world. And going back to Dr. Bailey, when she, talks about, how I'm reminded is something that you've mentioned, Dr. Bailey, that reminds me of even Trisha's work. And Trisha, I'll allow you to even share your thoughts, where especially coming from AI, right, where we see how machines taking over and how I'm reminded of a conversation I had with Trisha, as to my dear friend, as to how, oftentimes the knowledges that are presented, how they're presented, the positionalities that are used that are very exclusive. So can you imagine AI that's been programmed using the tenets or premises of specific ideologies that are very much so stereotypical or exclusive of the Black experience? So we see how that is also connected to neo colonization or colonialism that again can also be distorted as a form of liberalism, but it's not necessarily, because it maintains specific structures in place, and it maintains specific bodies in a very subjugated position. So thank you. These are some brilliant ideas. Go ahead, Trisha.
Hi, okay. So my first point is going to be back to Vern's, where she said knowledge is power. And the thing about I think knowledge is only powerful if we use it, if we apply it, because we can collect all the knowledge we want. But if we're not out there using it and sharing it, then, like, you know what I mean? It loses its power in some sense. So it's even go back to your own point of us going out there and educating the Black community, try to pull everybody along in. So yeah, but back to the machine point and the machine taking over, and Kathy mentioned how exclusive it can become. But the way we have to look at that is we have to take up space in a lot of things. And these AI become exclusive if we're not involved in it, if we're not in the development phase of it, if we're not doing it. Otherwise, these people who are doing it, AI is a representation of who builds it. Really? So if you have a room full of white men developing models or training it, it will have that same I don't want to use the word mentality, but it will have the same behavior or the same views of the people. It will represent the people doing it. So for us as a people, we have to go out there and take up space as well, be involved in this, create our own, right? Otherwise, the representation it will just continue to be what it is right now. Old white men leading the world, old white men setting the policies, and it will just move on to the same thing with AI, and the system continues the same way. So it's up to us to take up space in these places, create as well, right? Stop being consumers of things. And that is one of the biggest issue for us. We consume too much, right? We're not out there creating, developing as well. But anyways, to all the points you're saying, to what everyone is saying, we just have to take up space as well and be creators, be developers, and put your own representation out there versus just consuming. We just consume too much.
No, thank you, Tusha. Those are some critical points. I love what you've said there, especially when you describe power. It makes me think about Chimamanda Adichie's definition of power. When you talk about knowledge, but it makes me think about Chimamanda's definition of power, where she says that power is the ability to tell a person's story and to make that story the definitive story of that person. Because knowledge is like, especially now in our contemporary world, where knowledge is presented from that one particular single idea or single story of what it means to be human. And oftentimes in how we actualize the knowledges and the spaces, right? So we're moving from critical consciousness or cultural literacy and awareness to that of application, right? And that application piece, as you've explained, is that as how we actualize ourselves, right? In that. But I also feel that a part of that, and I'm trying to stay away from, or even being conscious of colonial ideologies that are oftentimes very linear in their structure, right? It's not cosmological, as in I'm thinking of indigenous epistemologies, where knowledge transcends in that each individual takes based on their own positionality in the world, build on that, pass it on, and it goes and it keeps going. So it's infinite in that sense, right? So as a part of that actualization process, I also feel that it's very important, as you've mentioned there too, as to being very conscious as to how we occupy those spaces and the purpose of how we, the reason or purpose for occupying those spaces, right? The intentionality behind occupying those spaces, which also makes me think about even in terms of STEM, right? And so even Michelle, if you want to also chime in as well, right? Based on your experience as an educator as well. And so where are we heading with, science and technology and Trisha, going back to, again, the conversation that we've had as well, right? How do we integrate STEM, even in curriculum, especially with, I got a notification, someone sent it to me, but it's something that we already aware of, right? It's a Black History curriculum, right? Moving away from and being even more deeper and critical in that, in terms of futurity, in building generations. Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Bailey.
No, sorry, my hand was.
No, I want to hear your thoughts as well, especially when it comes to STEM.
Oh, definitely. We have an inborn knowledge, I think, of STEM. We just haven't programmed it in some of our children. And so it becomes a parental concern in the community, and one can get critical about consumption and how the community consumes instead of trying to encourage and liberate the minds of the children. Nevertheless, I think there is a shift that's happening. So I'm optimistic about the future.
Good. How would you describe that shift?
I think the shift is happening in terms of awakeness, where parents are becoming awake, because usually when there's times of economic stress, some populations become more aware that they have to start programming the children for the future.
Mm, mm, yeah. No, I totally 100% agree with you. And Vern, I want to hear your thoughts as well, especially even in your field, right? And also Trisha, I'm inviting your thoughts too. Where we see or how we can reposition this as modes of resistance, right? In navigating spaces that are very carceral, and sometimes where we see youths or young people or it's difficult for them to even imagine themselves because they've been fed, they've been conditioned, and especially when there is, not a sense of structure in terms of understanding of cultural identities, because it's not something that is often affirmed. We can think of representation, right? And so representation, not just in terms of who is presented, but the information and the knowledges, right? And the cultural cues that are oftentimes very delegitimized in the very spaces. So the spaces are very violent, right? I'm thinking of Dr. Day's work, epistemic violence, that our students, our children on a regular basis have to endure, right? In these spaces because they're so carceral. So how do we then use this as a tool, not just of resistance, but going back to what Trisha mentioned in terms of self-actualization, taking up space, right? Not just demanding a seat at the table, right? But I'm thinking of Tyler Perry. Listen, I'm going to create my own table, right? I don't need to go and fight to sit at yours, but we have to occupy these spaces because we're talking about policies, right? Even if we think of autonomy in different ways, we also have to place policies because these are policies that are created that impact our communities drastically, right? Because our bodies, our lives, our existence are pinned against, coloniality, right? So how do we begin to reimagine? So I'll hear from Vern, and then I'll go to Trisha.
So I'm looking at when we were talking especially about like popular culture and so on. I'm looking at the boys that I work with in the prisons and how not only are their bodies imprisoned, but their minds are so imprisoned also. And we need to figure out how to reach these kids in ways that what Trisha was talking about, that they become less consumer and more creators. I look at some of these boys and they have so much potential. They have so much skill. They have such gifts, and they don't even realize the gifts they have because they're not ever taught to be creators and to be leaders and to use their authenticity in ways that are constructive and not destructive. So a lot of our kids, they do not know how to process all of what they're going through and all of the gifts they have in order to resist in ways that do not further imprison them and destroy them, but in ways that that they can become more constructive. And this is such a loaded and complex process, because I'm also thinking of when I look at this specific population, and I'm looking at the boys in prison. There's so much also Black rage that we have to also help them unpack this Black rage and convert this Black rage into constructive. So we also have to look at the spiritual and the mental trauma and injury that these kids are going through, because a lot of the time we're talking about, and we don't give our kids grace, and we're talking about what they're doing, and they're involving in these crimes, and they're doing all of these things, but we're not also considering that they don't even know how to process all of the things that they're going through, and the mental health and the spiritual health that we also, in speaking about all of these things, and where we want our children to prosper, we cannot do it within a vacuum. And so when we're talking about all of these things, we must never forget, and we must also include the healing part of it, because before we can embark on this resistance and this all of the things that we're talking about, we need to first of all deal with we have a saying in the Caribbean. We talk about like dealing with what's at home first, right? Making our bed first before we go out there. So and again, I'm thinking of these Black males who've been through the criminal justice system, and I'm just thinking of the imprisonment of the mind, and I'm thinking about how that spiritual injury, that psychological injury, the mental health aspect. We must always think about how are we going to help these kids move on. We cannot move on without dealing with this, dealing with these issues first. I'm not sure if you understand like what I'm saying. So
totally.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because there's so much pain there. There's so much Black rage. And I think that's also something that's also understudied. And also looked at in a very negative Eurocentric way, right? We look at Black rage and we think it's a bad thing. But I think it's Bell Hooks, who talks about Black rage. And we need to convert that Black rage into something constructive. And that Black rage, like Trisha was talking about, that creativity, and I love that piece. Black rage can be converted into such creative ways.
Yeah. Margin
Powerful.
too. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
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 Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
She talks about rage, right? How I'm trying to quote her specifically, where she uses the idea of a wall, right? In a very metaphorical way. So it's not just putting up a wall per se, right? But how do we be creative as to how we process that, right? How we see that, because it can be used as a tool. It can definitely be used as a tool. Yeah. Yeah. And that's the power. That's the power.
That's the power.
Yes. Black
and to take
African
on
spirit.
Yes, what Trisha was saying, not just having the knowledge, but activating that knowledge and using that knowledge to propel us into action.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
We're talking about agentic power, right? Using that agency, that and letting and showing these kids the agency they have, because they don't think they have power and agency.
Yeah.
right? They think that all this is acted upon them and there's nothing they can do. And the only way they can react is in destructive ways, right?
Yeah.
Right. And for them, this is their way of resisting. This is the only way they know how to resist.
Yeah.
Right. And also they think that the symbol of success is violence, which is what's been taught to them. Violent masculinity, owning the big chains and the cars and the this and all the materialistic things. These are the symbols of power, and this is the symbol of success, right? Which is so this is not what indigenous ways of knowing and being teaches us. That's not these are not the signs of success and power, right? This is what Western ways of knowledge have taught us, that this is what power is, right? Like violence and the machismo and all of these things. And these boys show all of these things, right? Like physical violence and the verbose and all of these things. So we need to start teaching our kids different ways of being that are also very powerful, right? That also translate into to power. There's just so much to unpack when we're dealing with our kids, because I think they are so hurt and they're so injured, and the trauma that they carry with them in their bodies and their minds. We need to deal with that first, right? That's one of the things that I'm really I see that every day. Like, I mean, I haven't worked with them for a while, but this is one of the things that just stands out with me, right? And that creativity piece, that we can tap into their creativity, right? And we can show them how to use that agency they have, because they just don't know how. They really don't know how. And again, looking at literacy and all of these things, these boys show so much originality and creativity in their vernacular, in their way of expressing themselves, in the way they dress, in the way they walk, in the way so we need to tap into all of these things and make them more constructive, instead of them using it in ways that destroy each other and destroy themselves. And also the piece where you talk about that self-destruction, that's self-hate. Yeah, that's where my thoughts are right now on that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Vern. No, those are some great ideas. I love what you've said there with a cultural and paradigm shift. Those are very important. Yeah. How do we, again, use these as tools, as vehicles, right? Yeah, for self-sustaining practices. Trisha, go ahead.
Okay. So there was a lot that Vern just talked about, and it made me think about generational trauma. Like you always hear that word, but I don't think I really understood that until this year, working with a Black therapist. And her work is focused on that. And what I've realized is a lot of us are walking around with a lot of damage and hurt. And damage, I know, is a very strong word. But when you have damaged people raising kids and so on, how it passes through, whether it's intentional or unintentional, right? So a lot of us, okay, we even think, okay, I wasn't abused when I was younger. I wasn't this, I wasn't that. So I'm fine, right? It goes beyond that. And I think that's what I really started understanding this year. It goes beyond something happening to you. It's, you know, it's especially us who were dragged across the Atlantic Ocean, right? That's in us, right? And there's a lot of work that needs to be done to shed that. And I'll just give you a quick example of this family, this Nigerian family I know. The husband does very well. He's like managing director of like one of the top financial companies worldwide. The mom is a stay-at-home and they have 3 kids. And every time you talk to the mom, she mentioned her kids. She has 2 teenage daughters and 1 5-year-old son. Whenever I talk to her, she always says she's raising leaders, right? You rarely hear those vocabulary amongst us. So she's raising her kids to be leaders. She's implanting that in their head, that they're being raised to be leaders. How many of us refer to our kids as that and raise them as leaders, that they believe they're going to be leaders, that they are leaders, right? So back to Vern's point, that's the thing. A lot of these boys that are in the system, right? I'm sure that's not what they were taught, right? They like, whether their parents intentional or unintentionally said things to them, there are a lot of things that we carry. And if they don't believe that they're more than what they are and that they can become more, right? Then they just go along with that self-hate, that they're useless. And even though a lot of us are showing, you know, walking around like, okay, they're not saying it out loud that they're useless, but a lot of us feel like we're useless, that we will not amount to anything. And sometimes those words are even said in passing to kids or to us, that you will not amount to anything, right? And that sits with a lot of these boys, right? So they don't see themselves beyond anything. They don't see themselves, you know, it's a lot. It's gonna take a lot of us. It starts with even us now who are woke to start using the correct vocabulary with our kids, with people, using the correct vocabulary, because it matters. It matters how we even do our self-talk and how we speak to them. It matters. So I try intentionally now to say, you know, those words to my own son, like, you know, that he is a leader, he is more, he is loved. Like, it seemed they seem like, because especially the way we were raised growing up in Jamaica, like, but it makes such a difference, and a lot of us don't realize the difference it makes. Like us on the call, yes, we're all educated now, we know what this means, we know the difference, we're trying to impart this knowledge. And it will take a lot of work to unlearn all the nonsense we have learned. Like, because you know that saying, sticks and stone can break our bones, that words won't. Like, that's one of the biggest farce there is, because the words live with us, the trauma live with us, and it's just, it will take a lot, right? But we have to start somewhere. And Vern, just keep doing what you're doing, right? Keep reassuring that these boys, these young men, that they're more than what they are. They're more than, because if you can free their mind while they're still incarcerated, when they actually get the opportunity to go out, they will live better lives, right? Because if your mind is free, and who is it? It was something I was reading about. It's not Marcus Garvey, it's Nelson Mandela. Even though he was in prison, his mind, right? His mind wasn't in prison. He still believed in something bigger, something better. But anyway, we're not going to solve all these problems today, but yeah, we just have to keep going at it and just reassuring the younger generation, and even ourselves, people our own age that we're talking to. A lot of us still needs to unpack and unlearn the damage that's been done to us. We don't realize it, but a lot of us with words have been damaged, and we ourselves, right? Because we can't damage people, can't heal damaged people. And I know damage is a strong word, but anyway.
Yeah.
But a lot of us need to heal ourselves and learn lots of the things.
Yeah, Trisha, I don't think it's a strong, it's appropriate word. It's damage. It's injury. It's trauma. We are. And again, the language piece you're talking about right now, I'm in St. Lucia. I've been here for almost 4 weeks. And the things, right, the language that becomes so normalized that we use with each other. The things, the things that have become normalized language, and we don't realize that it's because of colonization and internalizing the internal, that's the word. The things that we've internalized to become normal, and it's so anti-Black.
Yes, it is.
Right?
Black. Yeah.
So anti-Black, and we don't realize it. My people don't realize it. I'm struggling here in St. Lucia. I'm trying. And I keep telling myself, when you are on a vacation, I do not want to engage in these kinds of things. So sometimes I just have to close my eyes, close my ears, shake my head, because I'm like, my people need so much work.
Yes, it's the salience of it, as Dr. Day always, yeah. It is the salience, and the prevalence of it, right? So the internalized, I'm reminded, James Baldwin, he said the same. He said that, listen, oppression is not just about the oppressors, right? But then you become your own oppressor. You become complicit in your own destruction because of those internalized, as Trisha mentioned, damage of violence that we've been taught and conditioned to see ourselves. So we are enemy to ourselves because our indigeneity is not affirmed at all, right? The violence that has been inflicted is the uprootment or uprooting of who we are, because that severing is to separate us from self by way of land. So you're not just removing people from land, you're removing them spiritually, psychologically. So everything that they produced is seen as inferior. It's inferior to any sort of that is incapable of providing or of creating a sort of civilization. Of course, the irony of it all, because we know that the world in its existence as it is as a result of African civilization. So, it's totally understood. I hear you all, and it's a lot of work. But as what Dr. Day says, he says that, listen, when you're standing at the edge of the cliff, any step backwards is progress. Any step backwards is progress. So while we may seem as if, okay, this is daunting, this is like so much to unpack, but we're making progress. We're moving forward, right? We're moving forward. So I appreciate all of your thoughts, your ideas, the feedback that you've given based on that. We're just going to wrap up our session for today. I am so appreciative of all of you, right? Taking the time out of your day, out of your busy schedule for joining in and being here in service of community. You'll form with us just to get your feedback regarding today's session in moving forward in planning future sessions as well, and also to planning of part 2 of today's webinar. So I really do appreciate you. As I've said, this is just to recap what we've talked about, many of the ideas that we have discussed in terms of racism and oppression, empowerment and resilience, right? And how we know this in terms of how some of the ideas that Angelo is presented in her work as well, right? We've talked about the form and the style, right? As well as how she aligns themes with form and style, right? She talks about how Blackness also transgresses, but it's a form of empowerment and resistance, right? It goes outside of the colonial understanding, right, of self and of Blackness itself. We've talked about voice, tone, intonation, and the synergy that is mentioned. We've also talked about the observation of the stanzas, so the lines, right? So the first stanza sets the tone of resilience and unwavering strength, as she talks about. The middle stanza builds on this strength, recounting struggles and triumph. And then, of course, we have the final stanza that concludes with a powerful assertion of identity and empowerment, right? But still I rise, right? And then, of course, sharpening cultural sensibilities. I love that we've talked about the rage, very important. I love that we've talked about self-actualization. I love that it's very important. I love that we've talked about, in terms of colonial machinery, right? Especially in terms of moving forward. technology as what we see. I've seen it now in the advancement, and how do we push even in STEM and integrate and bring community into awareness, and being very creative as to how we bring community into awareness of that in that self-actualization process, and using this as a way of, which again, we already have it, as what Dr. Bailey said, we already have it, we know, right? But it's how do we turn or shift that thinking or paradigm, right? In moving from internal to the external of it, not to project the same violence, but also to integrate or interact in a very creative and innovative way in resisting and changing and building for the future. In that unpacking. These are just some pre-reading strategies that I've also included just for again, for a more deeper understanding, especially in not being familiar with, texts that are multidimensional in their approach. How do we begin to understand some of the ideas, right? And there are so many different, this list is not exhaustive at all, right? So activate prior knowledge, reflect on what you know about the cultural context and history. And again, I'm sharing this just for people who will be viewing. I do appreciate you all. Thank you so much for joining.